Είμαστε στο Παρίσι. Θα συναντήσουμε τον Wiiliam Kentridge στην γκαλερί Marian Goodman, έναν σπουδαίο καλλιτέχνη της εποχής μας, έναν ποιητή της εικόνας. Θα κουβεντιάσουμε μαζί του για όλο του το έργο. Θα δούμε πολύ μεγάλο μέρος από αυτό. Έναν καλλιτέχνη που προσπαθήσαμε πάρα πολύ να τον συναντήσουμε. Βέβαια, ο Wiiliam Kentridge γεννήθηκε και ζει στο Johannesburg. Μας κάλεσε να πάμε εκεί, αλλά δεν τα καταφέραμε, ίσως μια άλλη φορά. Καταφέραμε όμως να κλείσουμε μαζί τον ραντεβού εδώ στο Παρίσι, γιατί έχει έρθει για να επιβλέψει την όπερα «Ο Μαγεμένος Αυλός», The Magic Flute, μια όπερα που έχει σκηνοθετήσει εξ ολοκλήρου ο ίδιος και που έχει δουλέψει εικαστικά για αυτήν με ένα μοναδικό τρόπο. Και θα τελειώσουμε με μια επίσκεψη στο θέατρο που μας έγινε η μεγάλη τιμή να μας δεχτούν στην πρόβα, τη γενική πρόβα της καταπληκτικής αυτής δουλειάς. Πάμε να τον συναντήσουμε. Ελάτε μαζί μου. Mr. Kentridge, I have to tell you how happy I am to be here with you and have this short discussion. I want to know about your origin in South Africa.
Well, I was born in 1955, which in one sense is close to the beginning of the apartheid era in South Africa, which was 1948. And so for the first 45 years of my life, that was the world in which I grew up. And it certainly shaped an understanding of the world. Also grew up in Johannesburg, which is a very young city, only 120 years old, very different to the sense of Greek history, recent history. But it's a city that constantly remakes itself physically. Buildings get knocked down, new buildings get put up. What you think is a beautiful Art Deco building can get knocked down the next week. Hills which grow up around the city, which are from the mining in the city, get excavated because there's still some gold in them. So it's a sense of a city that is a kind of animation itself, erasing and redrawing itself. So in a geographic sense, it was an important place for me to grow up for what I did later. It's a hybrid city. In the country is very much, it's a city that's there's no long tradition of itself. It doesn't have a Greek tradition going back thousands of years to philosophers and playwrights. Family which comes from Eastern European Jews, Dutch and Germanic, other parts of Africa, some from Asia and Malaysia. So it's a real mixture of different. It's a city in which cosmopolitanism is built deeply into the structure, even though on the surface it seems either there was a big division between white people in one area and black people in another area. So it was a city in which one understood the imperative need for impurity, for bastardy, for mixing things, was the only hope, that things would come from different ways to rescue. And then for the last, since 1994, 1990, there's been the Transformed Society. I never knew that I was going to be an artist as a child. I had no idea of what I would be. I thought an engineer, an architect. Then I thought an actor. And I failed at all these different things, so I was reduced to being an artist. It was the only thing that was kind of left at the end of the line. And I started it once when I was sort of 18 at university and at art school, and then gave it up and worked in the film industry, and then came back to it some years later with a very different approach to it, a much lighter, easier approach to making images.
You are describing a link between things, a network, cities, situations, races, history. This is your work, actually. So let's talk about some parts of the work. You are living in Johannesburg, this is your country, you were born there, and you are living in your studio for many, many hours, we think. We don't know, but we suppose from what we hear, from what we read, and from what we see.
It's an absolutely vital location in which to work and place to work. Not just in the sense of the physical walls and the light and the facilities, but it's, I mean, if I have to think, what do I do most in my studio? I walk. So there are kilometers every day that are spent circling inside the studio. And it's not the same as saying, well, I'll go and walk for an hour, and I'll walk through the park, or I'll walk through the city, and then I'll come back to the studio. It has to do with walking in the studio, walking up and down, like an animal in a cage, that you're following it around. And I think it has to do with things that you see out of the corner of your eyes, and you see successively. And there's something about like repeating a mantra. These are mantras of images that you walk around, and they're on the walls of the studio. And it's in that stupid walk. I mean, there's an important, one has to understand that a studio is a protected space for stupidity, a safe space for stupidity, where you're allowed to not know what you're doing or why you're doing something, for things to be ridiculous and wrong. And that's, for me, a very important part of studio life. So even though there are people who work for me in the office, doing administrative things, it's important that the studio itself is pretty much a solitary space. Not because when I'm working I need to be completely alone, but because the ridiculousness of a lot of the activity needs a kind of privacy to escape. It's, I mean, there's, not to push the idea too far, but I think there's a way in which the studio becomes an enlarged head. This is what one is thinking. The thoughts that shift in one's head. How does this connect to that? How does this liner cut connect to that drawing, to this piece of theatre that I'm working on? Those are thoughts that you would have in your head, and they get externalized as a physical walk across the studio. And the thoughts, in a way, get externalized to here's the one drawing, here's another, there's the piece of paper on the table, here's the charcoal, one can take and test something out. So the physicality of the studio, the physicality first in terms of working with material in one's hand on a paper, that conversation. And then at a second level of corporeal physicality of walking around, the body in the studio. The performance of moving through the studio the whole time is another very important. And sometimes that becomes the subject of a work of art, which is about the studio.
When was the time that you understood that you are interested in picturing every second or every moment of your drawing? I mean, like sequences of a story.
I mean, there are different answers I can give to that question. One of them is I was working on a piece of theatre and thought, okay, I want to... The first would be I realized that I'd done animation from when I was like 14 or 15. Each time I think I've remembered the first piece of animation I did, someone comes and shows me a piece I'd done earlier. So as a high school child, I was doing drawings and animating them and moving objects in front of the camera. That's one answer. The other was I was interested when making a drawing, at the moment when a drawing starts very quickly and loosely, you start with a lot of confidence and openness. And as the drawing progresses, one gets more cautious about ruining the drawing. So you've done a beautiful start of a drawing, and you're continuing, you want to keep the part that seems to be. So it gets more and more cautious, and then if you overwork it, the drawing dies. You lose courage. So I thought I would film the process of making a drawing to see what is the moment when the drawing starts to die. And started filming drawings, the activity of making a drawing, and discovered, in fact, the drawing could keep on moving endlessly and become its own film. So that was another origin of the animation. The third was I was working in theatre and had a backdrop and wanted to be able to make a backdrop that could move, the scenery to move. So that was another route into the animation. I'm not sure which is the truth or which is the first one. They all happen. There often I find when you find an image or an activity there's an overdetermination. There are more causes than you need for it to happen. There are many different things pushing for one thing to emerge.
When you started to draw, you were a teenager, and I've read that then the idea of painting by oils came up. Tell me about the first moment that you remember yourself now that you are this age, that you had the pencil and a piece of paper, a small piece of paper. What did you first think that you would like to do?
When I was at university, I went to art school in the evening classes, painting and life drawing and all of this. And at that stage, drawing in a sense was a preliminary stage to painting. Painting was the real activity. And our teacher, who was a remarkable man, once came to us with a proposition saying, he'd heard it said that in South Africa, only black artists could draw the figure. White artists were all busy doing abstract paintings, and only black artists were still interested in the figure. So he said, I want you to go off and spend the week and think about that and do a figurative drawing. Not as an exercise, but as a work in itself. So that was a very big revelation to me, to think, okay, this could be a drawing, not a painting. It could stick with the figuration. It didn't have to go towards American color field. 1970s, everyone was looking at American color field abstraction. Clement Greenberg was king. So to have the encouragement to say, no, one can work in a very different tradition, a different trajectory, without it being a reactionary movement away from the contemporary, was an important line. I think then when I started working with etching, the first etching lesson I had, and started doing Ofo, that was also an extremely important moment because it legitimized not working with color. Here was an art form in which its essence was black and white, where to color it is, in a sense, a stupid decoration of an etching. But the essence of it is. So if one was then working with etching, which is linear, in my case figurative, but monochromatic, that gave a way of thinking about all the other work that could come from that, whether it turns back into drawings or theatre or film. There was also, of course, a way in which photography had a very long and honourable tradition of monochromatic, also black and white photography. So in a way, I suppose it was cinema, engraving, black and white photography that were the supports behind thinking about what work I was doing. And even though I loved coloured paintings, Matisse, the Impressionist, I understood that was not for me. Not out of principle, just because I couldn't do it.
I think for people that love and know your work, they understand, we all understand that you want to lead us in a kind of thinking about the stories and the heroes, that you are responsible for them. And this is my question now. Why do you feel responsible for the heroes?
I think because I'm not a novelist. If you're a novelist, you are able to invent and imagine yourself in other people's worlds. So you're a man and you're writing with a woman character, you have in a sense to imagine yourself into her head, into her body, what she would be doing. Or other characters in your books. I have a very bad imagination for that. So the characters, in a sense, all have to start with what would my response be, what would my impulse be to that situation? What would this other very different person's response be? And for that, they're very limited and they're very held back in what they can and can't do, the characters. So I think that's why I do feel, even though I'd love not to be responsible for them, there is a way in which. It's also a sense in which in some kinds of animation, a lot of animation, the history of animation, one thinks of Tex Avery, is about actions without consequences. So you have someone and they get stabbed 30 times with a knife, and you see all the knives sticking out of them, and for one frame they've collapsed, and then they pull them all out and they resurrect themselves. A safe falls on their head, and for the first frame the person is flat, and then he's back okay again. So it's about damage, never taking responsibility for the violence or the damage, which allows an enormous range of transformations within animated drawing. And for me it's always been much more restricted in the sense that the objects struggle to change their form. And I think they struggle because my imagination is limited in imagining other points, but also in the sense that if it becomes too easy, if it makes no difference what something becomes, then it loses the pressure of saying then there is necessity behind that transformation.
In the case of animation, we have imagination much more than reality coming up. On the contrary, in artistic work, in your work actually, we have reality coming up. I know people that they support the idea of Kentridge, who is the poet of the image of our century. I mean, okay, yeah, I know, it's very... I don't know if history has to do with this, but this is a reality. I would like to tell us about technology, animation, and imaginary. How do you manipulate to have equal quantities of every one of each areas to make actually the work?
I think one of the things I do is it's all very low tech. It's something I can do with my hands. It's either drawing and erasing, or it's drawing and tearing, or it's painting and tearing and jointing figures and moving them. So I think that's part of it. You can see the sense of understanding how it's physically made when you're looking at it is an important part for me. It makes a lot, I think an important part for me is leaving a lot of space for recognition. So not knowing in advance, but recognizing something as it emerges. So there's never a script or a storyboard. It starts with some images and try to see how they could possibly develop. It might be, for example, I've been doing a series of lino cuts, of like woodcuts. And there are some that are made, there's a portrait and there's a figure. And in both cases, the original print is rather dull. It's not very interesting. But when the picture gets torn up into 4 pieces, and then those 4 elements slightly rearranged, every one of the rearrangements is more interesting than the first one. So it's allowing an openness in a larger scale for that process to happen. Not to say you tear up a blank piece of paper and it becomes something, but there's an impulse and then that gets destroyed and then you see what in fact is behind the impulse. So it's finding strategies for allowing that process to happen. So not having a script is one strategy. Tearing things up is another strategy. Working with found images would be a third way of allowing that pathway to open between what you make and what you see, and that conversation between that which comes towards you from the world or the piece of paper and that which you project onto it. So a horse like that, there's a sense of, you look at a shape there that, on the one hand it's torn pieces of paper, as you can see, but there's a sense inside you of what horseness is that meets it halfway, and that's the negotiation that I'm always interested in.